Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of RChain, including our foundational language, Golang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
Well, first of all, thank you, Derek, for hosting the podcast and for all your work on the back end. You do a fantastic job of transcribing and making sure that we have social media awareness of the podcast. So really appreciate the hours you put in on that. And thanks to everyone for joining the conversation. I think it should be an interesting one. One of the things that we wanted to talk about today, the primary thing we wanted to talk about today was climate change and how blockchain addresses some of the climate change problems. I hope that everyone has had a chance to see Greta Thunberg's amazing speech to the UN summit. And, I'm with her all the way. It's wrong for her to be the one that's up there. She should be back at school. And I'm laughing because if I don't laugh, I'll probably burst into tears. We're going to have to deal with, and I think, Greta pointed this out pretty clearly, or if she stated it somewhat implicitly, but pretty clearly, that there are consequences that are already happening. We're already going to deal with consequences. There's just nothing else that there's no way around that part. That it's already in motion, and part of those consequences will have to deal with the displacement of people and having to move infrastructure. So move coastal cities, move agricultural efforts. So there's going to be a lot of global coordination just to deal with the fallout of where we are now. Beyond that, of course, there's, what can we do to turn the situation around? And so we're sort of wanted to have this gang of this motley crew talk about how blockchain addresses some of those things. Let's go ahead and maybe do a round robin of introductions. I'll pass it over to Nora. You want to introduce yourself and how you got into this and what you're hoping to get out of the conversation, and then pass it on to the next person.
Sure. So thank you so much. I'm Nora Germain, and I got into this project because Greg invited me to be part of it last year. And I'm really passionate about the climate crisis, as I think all people should be, living on planet Earth. Daryl and I have been working pretty closely on trying to define some of the ways that RChain can kind of guide this conversation. And invite more people to be part of it as RChain builds out testnet and mainnet. So we're just, really trying to refine that conversation, invite more people in. So that's what we're working on. So I guess I'll pass it to Daryl then.
So yes, I got involved with RChain back in the scenario days when we were working on a open source social network. And I kind of still carry that thought with me whenever I think about RChain. And so when you look at the front page of RChain, it says, RChain is a cooperative building a blockchain platform and social coordination technologies that address the world's greatest problems. And I agree with Nora and Greg that climate change is the biggest problem that humanity has ever confronted. And we created it so we can stop it. I think, for me, when I first realized that in a more profound way was when I listened to the audiobook of James Hansen's Storms of My Grandchildren. This would have been around 2003 when I listened to that audiobook. At that moment, I realized that I was going to do what I could to help solve the problem. That's basically where I come from. I'll pass it on to Christian.
Hi, I'm Christian. I've been on these podcasts many times now. I'm a researcher for RChain. and I'm very glad to be a part of this. I wanted to talk about climate change today because in the past year, I feel like I've woken up to the reality. I think there's a big difference between acknowledging it's a problem and actually like comprehending the urgency and magnitude of it. I think reading the 2018 IPCC report was what really woke me up. Now I'm trying to figure out how to wake other people up as well, because I do think it's really a psychological problem. I really want to talk about how RChain could help, because we have so much infrastructure that we take for granted now that might not be stable over the next century. And the internet, even though we depend on it so deeply, is something that depends on so many things going right. If it becomes unstable, we need to have local, robust, decentralized local networks so that people are able to coordinate, like Greg has been saying. Yeah, I just think this is a really important issue, and I think that RChain can help in a big way. So I'll pass it to Isaac.
Hey everybody, my name is Isaac. You've probably heard my voice many times on this podcast because, like Christian, I've also appeared on several of these. So I am a mathematician and I do some development and research work for RChain on the formal verification front. As everybody has stated so far, and I agree with, that climate change is one of, if not the biggest problems that humanity is facing. I know that blockchain will play an integral part in our coordination efforts and trying to come to some sort of different state of existence where we can have a positive impact on the environment, or maybe just a less negative impact as we're having now. And so what I would like to get out of the conversation is just more specific ways that the RChain platform can play a role in this. I don't know if anybody else is still left.
No, I think that was it. And that was
Yeah.
great. I mean, I really appreciate each and every one of you, your efforts for RChain, but also just, standing up and saying, why climate change is important to you. That I think that still takes courage in the US. It doesn't take the same kind of effort in some other parts of the world where it's accepted as a fact. But in the US, it still takes courage to stand up and say, yeah, climate change is a real thing. And we need to start working on it now, pronto. With respect to consequences we cannot avoid, most of the scientists and folks that I've talked to recognize, for example, the Malibu fires, which displaced a whole bunch of people, among them my wife's sister, who ended up having to leave her home, which was burned to the ground, and come and live with us for a while until she was able to get back on her feet. This kind of thing is only going to happen at greater frequency and greater volume and greater urgency. In her case, she didn't have to move from one part of the world to another. And so her driver's license still worked, and her credentials followed her passport still worked. But a lot of people are going to be facing displacement where their identification doesn't work. I think a lot of people are recognizing that the caravan, as it was referred to last year, were effectively climate refugees. And we're going to see more and more of that, where we're starting to see climate refugees. And if they cross these kind of jurisdictional boundaries where their identity is no longer so easily established, their credentials are not easily established, that's going to present a major problem if we start seeing these en masse. So the example that I try to use is the Syrian refugee crisis, where this is a real issue. People were not able to prove that they had been doctors or lawyers or teachers or whatever. But the blockchain provides a really nice solution for that, right? The blockchain provides a means by which people can establish online their identity. And as a part of that, they can hang their credentials on that identity. And then they're addressable in another way, which is that they can be the recipient of relief funds. Their identity can be tied to an address on the blockchain, which could be a place where relief funds could be issued. And I think that that's a big issue in refugee camp. People don't know where someone is from and whether or not they're the appropriate recipient of relief. And that causes all kinds of issues for people who are providing relief, as well as for people who are in need of relief. So the blockchain, at a minimum, begins to address those kinds of problems. Now, admittedly, identity is a deep and complex issue, but it's one that a lot of people have been thinking about for a very long time now. And we do have workable solutions that we could put into play today to begin to solve these kinds of problems. It's not as complicated as carbon sequestering or other kinds of things. And blockchain can provide a really nice solution there. Let me just kick off, sort of get other people's thoughts about this and maybe some other ways in which the blockchain can begin to address just the consequences that we're going to be dealing with before we get to turning things around.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. Greta said in her speech at the UN the other day, she's and so many millions of other kids, have this huge burden, but a lot of them are the lucky ones, which is so crazy to think about. And a lot of people have this high level of climate anxiety going on, which I also have. And I think it kind of started when I was a kid, like my grandfather founded the State Natural Areas Program in Wisconsin, which some of you might know, but like I was taught, that this saving the planet was really important. And, I grew up with a lot of anxiety about it, and it's getting really, a lot worse. I haven't had any family members that have died because of a natural disaster that has been exacerbated by climate change. So just to think that, we are the ones that are lucky, is really crazy. But to get back to what you were saying is there are going to be a lot more refugees, and they're going to be, not having bank accounts that necessarily can transfer between countries and stuff. So just the fact that they might be able to have crypto-enabled bank accounts would really help. But also I think your idea about identity is really going to be helpful. And it's possible that, RChain might be able to say, okay, well, here are some key areas where RChain could provide, solutions or ideas for the climate crisis. And one of them could be identity solutions. That could be something that's really interesting. And one other thing that I thought of is a lot of these conflicts that we see around the world, like why people are migrating, is not always because of just military conflict or, uprisings like in Syria, like you mentioned Syria, but also the crisis at the border. A lot of those people are coming because, they can't grow crops. Like Syria had this extremely long drought, which obviously destabilized the region. And then, of course, the war broke out and all this stuff happened. But, if you look at all this stuff, it's really easy to get this, climate defeatism. People have been writing these articles that sort of hint at the fact that we really can't change what's going to happen. And it's true that there's a level of catastrophe that is already baked in. But, some people are also saying, denialism, climate denialism and climate defeatism are two sides of the same coin, because they basically both result in us doing nothing. And so I think as we talk about these issues that are really complex and really overwhelming and really difficult, I think it's also really important that we don't fall into the defeatism trap, and that we realize that there is still something that we can do.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's really crucial to be positive. But I feel like my perspective on this has been evolving a lot pretty quickly as I really dive into all the information. And everything we can do towards mitigation right now is really, really important and will be a matter of many millions of lives. But I've also noticed that the vast majority of the thought and effort, it seems from what I've gathered so far, that it seems that it has been focused on mitigation. Like Greg was saying, like we're already feeling many of the effects. The other very pressing issue is adaptation. And it shouldn't be like an either or thing. Like I think we're at a point where it's late enough in the game that both are completely essential. the way I'm thinking about it right now, the way blockchain is going to help is through millions of refugees. And how to handle their identity and their relief. That's a form of adaptation.
I tend to agree. It's both adaptation and mitigation and lots of other things as well. I fundamentally believe that we're going to have to get to more decentralized approaches to things like agriculture. The agribusiness is really destructive to the environment. We've known this for a while, and we have to think about the entire supply chain holistically. And that's really the issue, is that a lot of this has to do with a kind of global coordination. I've said this a million times, but this is really, to me, the nub of the issue. We now have to be able to coordinate in a way that we haven't ever contemplated coordinating before. And so it's not just supply chain management, but it's also management of resources that we thought geography mattered, but maybe geography doesn't matter in the same way. So yes, it makes a lot of sense for people living in the Amazon region to be shepherds and stewards of that region. But at the end of the day, they're shepherds and stewards of a region that the entire planet depends upon. Since all of us depend upon it, maybe we all need to be able to have discourse about those resources. And that's a radical idea. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a radical idea. But I think that it's something that we absolutely have to begin to contemplate, and not just contemplate, but begin to take action on. And what that means is that we need a new way to capture will and sentiment that transcends a lot of the existing jurisdictional boundaries. And that's another place where blockchain begins to play an important role.
I think what you're talking about sounds like kind of more global awareness, which is like, the global local awareness, which is really like, if everybody takes care of their local environment, the whole world will be taken care of, which is something that I think everybody needs to really focus on if we want to take care of the planet, because it's so easy to think, oh, what's happening on the other side of the world versus like what's happening in my backyard, what's happening in my neighborhood, like, you know what I mean? That mentality. And I think Daryl, like, you kind of turned me onto that concept. That's been really helpful for me to understand this whole issue.
That's part of it, but I'm also suggesting something radical, which is that maybe everybody on the planet gets to have a say about what's going on in the Amazon, and also with other kinds of resources. I'm not picking on the Amazon as the only thing, but I believe that there are resources that are so precious in terms of the interlocking of ecosystems that it might be the case that we need a different kind of order, that the existing geographically based jurisdictions don't make sense anymore. And that's a very radical thing to say. That says that existing governments don't have the same kind of jurisdiction. I understand how weird and crazy that sounds. But when we're talking about existential crisis, and that's what we're talking about, then we have to consider all solutions. In particular, I'm very interested in how blockchain can record the sentiment and will of large-scale communities. And when I say sentiment and will, well, think of Facebook, right? People go to Facebook and they go to Twitter and they go to Instagram to get literally a feeling for how people are responding to a particular phenomenon. Do they like it? Do they love it? Does it make them angry? That kind of collection of sentiment information is really important. I don't think that kind of information should be stuck in the hands of centralized businesses. If we were to put that on a global computer like the blockchain, a scalable global computer like the RChain blockchain, then it would become an information resource that is of vital significance when we're talking about coordination. And I think it goes beyond just the collection of sentiment. I think the collection of sentiment feeds into the formation of will. We're going to put resources behind an action. So we're going to fund a particular project. We're going to appoint people who have roles of responsibility. And those kinds of actions require, democratic exercise of will, right? So voting or other kinds of mechanisms. And again, blockchain-based democratic expression of will is another piece of the puzzle. This is just one of the pieces of coordination technology that I think the blockchain supports. I hate to dive in sort of at the deep end with respect to this discussion. I do think that this is where we are. I feel reluctant to say this out loud, but I think that that's where we are in terms of the kinds of solutions that are necessary. And actually, the step that humanity is being asked to make.
I agree with what you're saying, Greg, because the way I see it, it's like we're dealing with a global issue on a scale that we've never dealt with before. And we're still kind of approaching it from the same paradigm that we've had for who knows how long, in terms of having only, local jurisdiction or things of that nature, when really it's everybody's planet, and we all need to be able to get together and express our sentiment and will about particular regions, not just if you live there.
It's a really important point, I think, you're making. And I mean, it is radical because it's questioning like the largest structural authority on the planet is nation states. But there's this mismatch between dealing with things on a national level when you're trying to address a global issue. There's like a conflict of interest there where nations are instinctively designed for self-protection and self-preservation, and they have the preconceptions that, a nation kind of comes with the preconception that they have a stable world, and self-preservation then becomes limited to a definition of economic stability and growth. And that's extremely limited. And that's why we're seeing this ridiculous mismatch where in the meeting of the UN, it's fantastic that we have the UN, but it doesn't have the authority. And so the nations are still able to sit back and say, well, we're going to do our best as we define our best to be, but, we're still limited to these preconceptions about what needs to be done. And that's a really important shift in mindset, but it makes you wonder how do you possibly affect such a radical transformation in the power structure?
Well, I think that was what attracted me to the blockchain in the first place, was that, at the moment people began to talk about smart contracts and to think about how does this relate to a legal contract. And then people began to understand that, oh my God, these smart contracts running on this global computer can involve, entities spread around the globe.
Yeah.
There's no jurisdiction that can address it. How do you adjudicate a smart contract that involves resources that are tied together in Europe and Asia and the US and South America, which is quite easy to do with the blockchain. It's a no-brainer. You don't even have to break a sweat to put together smart contracts that do that. And on top of that, just because some judge in one of those jurisdictions says, well, there's a problem with this smart contract, doesn't mean that anything can be done about it. The resources can be cryptographically secured, and that's that. Done. End of story. Sorry. You spend the next 10,000 years breaking that code.
As long as the entities involved recognize the authority of that chain, then...
Exactly. So to me, the blockchain was right smack dab in the middle of that conversation. It asserted, hey, we've got a problem with the way jurisdictions work, because the blockchain was offering this. It does offer a much more radically efficient infrastructure for a lot of the kinds of things that we're going to need to coordinate, but it doesn't line up with the jurisdictional boundaries. That's why I was attracted to the blockchain in the first place, was that I could see this looming issue of a need for a mindset shift, and the blockchain was right at the forefront of that discussion. There are other things that can be done here that the blockchain offers. Like, we're going to have to radically shift supply chain management, and the blockchain offers fantastic tools for supply chain management. A really good example is there's all kinds of metadata associated with energy trading. We know lots and lots about whether a particular supply of energy or lot of energy is clean or brown, or its provenance, and all of that can be added to the trading mechanism if you use the blockchain. And there's a company called Expansive, which RChain gave a lot of funds to, that has been working on this problem. I don't know where they are in their overall development now, but they have been working on exactly this problem. And I think that many others need to be working on this problem, where just beginning to add important metadata to the transaction. A big part of the problem has been that, the nature of our transactional behavior has been myopic. Just looking at the chits on the scoreboard, as opposed to looking at the overall consequences of, does this transaction have knock-on effects that we don't want to support. We've begun to see this, right? There's been this kind of consumer activism that's been going on for a few decades now. But this can happen at a much greater scale the more you can get information associated with the transactional behavior. And the blockchain is really, really good at that, especially blockchains that can handle data. Payment-based chains, chains that are optimized for just payment-style transactions, they're not going to be so good at this. But chains that develop to the point where they can handle data at scale, they're going to be ideal for this kind of coordination. And that's one of the things that I've been, on and on about with respect to RChain, is that the next phase for blockchain is to escape the feedback loop, the optimization loop that keeps it stuck in payments type solutions, and move it into data style solutions. Because once you do that, then you can go after these kinds of supply chain management problems. Whether you're talking digital assets or you're talking digital tracking of physical assets, these are real problems that the blockchain is really good at. And in particular, RChain can really excel at, because we're talking about data at volume. That's another place where I think blockchain has a lot to say in terms of climate change. In particular, this is all about the adaptation part. We know that we cannot continue business as usual.
I think it's kind of obvious to some of us here that the question really isn't, how can blockchain help climate change? It's more, how can climate change be solved without blockchain?
Yes. I mean, that's so right on, in my opinion.
Because the radical transformation that we're all talking about here, and I'm so happy to be in a conversation with people who seem to all agree that we do need to go through some kind of radical transformation. One of the things that kind of I've been thinking about is, how are we going to be able to do that peacefully? When you step back and look at the actual real source of the problem here, the real source of the problem is potentially also the real source of the solution. And the real source of the problem, I think you can isolate as 20th century capitalism. 20th century capitalism brought forth untold development in well-being for more and more people around the planet, but it also created the biggest problem that we have to solve. And that's just because of how 20th century capitalism evolved, where we built in a system that ignored externalities. We've now created the world's greatest externality, and that's through use of oil. So how do we solve that problem? And I think that the way to solve that problem isn't to fight against the problem. It's to create new solutions that help the problem transition to the next level. So we need to kind of find solutions for externalities outside of taxing and punishing. We need to kind of build the solutions of the externalities into the next generation of what capitalism will become. Some call it post-capitalism. I don't know what you want to call it. I don't think we'll have a name for it until we find it, but it's not this. And we need to find it like within this generation.
Approaching all of this from an economic perspective, I think even more than the political perspective might be the most effective, because the economy is a lot more responsive to changes in the collective ethos than like the insulated bureaucracies of governments. We've been seeing that in the way that we can pressure companies to make changes, in the way that competition forces, as soon as one of them capitulates to some demand, the other ones need to follow, otherwise they'll be falling behind. There was just this really good article by Bill McKibben about divestment. He was defending it could be one of our most powerful levers in this fight. Even just like if everybody switched from a bank like Chase to a credit union, they are by far the world's biggest investor in fossil fuels. So that's one lever that sometimes people forget about, that everybody can make a difference in.
I look at it systemically. When I look at the overall economic landscape, I see that the vast majority of capital is concentrated in the hands of a few. They've shown little interest in shifting that landscape, even though it's been pointed out for quite some time now that this is a major source of problems for a lot of people, and sits very much at the nexus of humans kind of suffering that we're seeing and climate change. What I've suggested is again, it's completely value neutral. It's just a mathematical fact that if you have that kind of landscape, then you cannot explore the full range of coordination models that are available through economic activity. If you've committed to deployment of resources, and that deployment of resources is not changeable, it's fixed or relatively fixed, then there's just fewer models that you can actually explore, which means that the ability to coordinate is less flexible. That's value neutral. It doesn't say whether I think highly or poorly of plutocrats and oligarchs. It just is the fact that as long as we have an oligarchical arrangement, we cannot explore the full range of coordination models, and we need all models available now because the situation is so dire. And the ability to get to a new arrangement, again, to me, that comes from blockchain, because what blockchain does is it allows the community to create a new value system. They can say, these are the things we value. Here's the token or financial infrastructure and computational infrastructure that supports this kind of valuation. So we value these behaviors that diminish carbon emissions, for example. And so we're going to give economic benefit to those agents, those humans and institutions that are engaged in that behavior. I have long suggested that, hey, let's start with a few experiments. Let's start with that kind of idea in a lower risk situation like music or entertainment. At this point, I think we're out of time. We don't get to run those nice experiments in quite the way I had anticipated or hoped for, but we might have to jump to the chase and start, rebooting financial systems for communities who are willing to take the plunge. Again, it's a radical idea. At this point, I think it's time for the radical ideas.
When you were talking about recording more valuable metadata in economic interactions, I wasn't sure exactly of an example that you had in mind, but one that I've always had in mind was that we need to start monitoring supply chains so that we account for the carbon emissions of the production of any good or service. And of course, it's a big question that may involve some estimations, but by now we have the technology that if we wanted to, every time you buy something, it should come with information about exactly its environmental impact. This should be made transparent to the consumer. Something that you have to know, every time that you choose to buy something or fly somewhere. That needs to just start being very explicit at the forefront of everybody's mind. And we certainly have the technology to do that right now. It's just a matter of whether we set up the framework with blockchain and whatever kind of instrumentation we need, and whether we can get companies to agree to it. But I think it's one of those issues that's so common sense. It's not even a partisan thing. It's about, just like general awareness that I feel like that would be totally possible in like 5 years if we worked really hard.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I was using the example of energy trading, where we know a lot more about the cleanliness or other kinds of production provenance with respect to lots of energy, whether you're talking barrels of oil or natural gas or even electricity. We know whether those lots are green in the sense that they're environmentally friendly, or brown in the sense that they're environmentally unfriendly. And that data can be associated with those transactions, and it's not currently done with energy trading today.
just last week, Nora introduced me to a fellow named Christoph, who started this thing called Nori, Nori. And it's kind of connected to what you guys are talking about. So it's a blockchain initiative where, let's see, it says Nori's two-sided marketplace is a scalable incentive system to measure and verify soil carbon. We make it simple for companies to pay farmers to restore their soil health and pull carbon dioxide out of the air. The general idea, if I understood Christoph's explanation right, is that people have the ability to purchase credits that are verifiably doing something to help offset CO2 levels. I love Christian's idea of some kind of labeling system that whenever anybody wants to buy something or travel somewhere, they have an understanding of the economic footprint involved or the environmental footprint involved. And then Nori would fill in the blank saying, okay, here's how much money you need to pay, and here's how to pay it. And then you pay this amount of money, and that money goes towards doing something to help stop the problem.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great idea also because it's not just that you're paying money to offset your carbon footprint, but actually that money actually goes to verifying that the carbon that you polluted, that the money actually is going to taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. I think that's a really cool thing about it, that the money isn't just going to nowhere, it's being verified on the blockchain. But the trick is that I think using a blockchain that also doesn't use an enormous amount of energy would be awesome. And I found a lot of different projects. One thing I've been focusing on for about the past month, and that Daryl and I have been working on together, is making several different lists of different blockchain and non-blockchain based environmental and climate-based projects to reach out to invite to either become members of RChain or to invite to build on RChain and just to be part of our community. So we're going to be reaching out to them soon. We really want to expand the conversation, and also Daryl and I really want to clarify the why of RChain is what we've been talking about. What is the impetus to build this blockchain? Is it just to look at the price of rock or rev, or are we really trying to do something that is going to transform the way people are able to coordinate and all that? And so we're really trying to create a way to explain this to people. Obviously, nobody has a singular answer for the climate crisis, but I think inviting more people to be part of the RChain community who are passionate about the climate is going to be a big step forward.
That's so great, Nora. One thing I kind of want to emphasize there too is that eventually everyone is going to come to the realization that this is the greatest problem we have to solve as a global species. And I think that what's going to happen is that's going to become the biggest way to make money. So if you're somebody who is strictly focused on making lots of money, get into this. It's part of the way to solve this. Like I said before, I don't think it's going to get solved by punishing. I think it's going to get solved by realizing that there's greater reward for all by getting involved in this. One of the perks will be survival of the species. And so, yeah, I think it's important to kind of look at it from that perspective.
Sorry, is that list available somewhere? This is really great.
Sure. Well, right now I'm working on 4 different master lists. They're like 4 different main categories of different groups that I thought would be great for us to reach out to. And I'm happy to send them to you. There's like a climate list, there's a sort of social good list, there's some arts organizations, and then there's also social coordination organizations. So basically there's like these 4 main lists. But if you just want the climate initiatives, I'm happy to send that over. But I'll tell you, most of those are not blockchain projects because naturally most climate projects just haven't integrated with blockchain yet. But I'm looking for more who have or who want to.
There's a cautionary tale for the blockchain space. This summer I had a conversation with one of our star developers. He's been with the project from the beginning. He started asking questions on one of our channels, and I realized immediately, oh wow, here's a real mind. Here's someone who thinks for himself and thinks in a way that he can get things done. And it's been my honor and privilege to work with Kent Shikama. But this summer he came to me and he said, look, I'm just really not inspired by the blockchain community. There's just too much focus on speculation and not enough focus on what I think the real, what are values that align with what makes me excited. And as a result, he's moving on from the blockchain space. He's not going to be working in blockchain. As of October 15th, he leaves the co-op, and then he's not going to be working in blockchain, at least according to what he's told the team. Fortunately for us, we were able to find another talented developer to take up the position that he left vacant. Not that we can fill his shoes, because Kent is just one of those people who just, anything he sets his mind to, he can get done. I just feel like we need those people. We need the young people who really have the fire burning. And more than that, I also noticed we've been filling a project manager position. And yesterday I spoke with one of the candidates, and he was asking, well, who are the stakeholders for RChain? And after I gave the sort of traditional list of the stakeholders, I said, well, and there's another implicit list of stakeholders. These are the people that Greta Thunberg and my children represent. These are the people that need a set of tools to help them coordinate, long after we're gone. Those are also the stakeholders in this project. And his response was, wow, that really makes a difference in terms of how I approach this role. That invigorates me, that excites me, and gives my work purpose. And I feel like the more we make blockchain about speculation and making money, the more the people we really need to attract are going to go, this is not what I came to do. This isn't my purpose. This isn't my meaning. I think we really have to understand that. What people want and what gets them out of bed and what makes them excited and be able to give that extra effort is meaning and purpose. And I can't think of a greater meaning and purpose right now than to address humanity's existential crisis, which we brought upon ourselves.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry to give such a long-winded response. I did want to hear from other people. One person who normally stays quiet and neutral in all of this is Derek. And I just, I know that it's your job to be host, but I think you might have some opinions about what we're talking about as well. And I wondered if you wanted to say a few words.
Sure. I think I'll take a slightly different tack, but one of the things that really has taken me aback, but I guess it shouldn't be surprising in the current political environment, is the number of people on social media attacking Greta Thunberg as if she were a plant by adults, or that there's an agenda behind it. I mean, there is an agenda, an important one. And it's really disconcerting, especially seeing people, peers of mine in their 40s, talking about a 16-year-old in such a way. What it really makes me wonder is that as adults, have we become so bitter and polarized that we can't think that teenagers can't think for themselves? One of the points that she makes, and some other teenagers were at the UN conference this week, were discussing, we've left them with this world. They would like to make it to their 70s and 80s and 90s, as we hopefully will be able to, people our age. They're going to have a much greater challenge than we are. There's a theory or a philosophy in Buddhism of constantly seeing through new eyes. It's part of empathy and the development of compassion, but the understanding that we were also teenagers who had ideas, and to be able to look at the problem and what they're facing from their age and the obstacles that they have to overcome. I really just wish that people of any age would understand that, and that these people care passionately about this problem. And it's really, really sad the way that we've polarized these situations where, as you've said many times, Greg, it's an all hands on deck situation. And if we don't treat it as that, then the consequences are going to be dire for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very worrying.
Well,
That's
yeah. I mean, actually, your voice is more important than mine, Christian, because you're in that generation.
I was just gonna say that's why I really want to think and talk more about the crisis as a psychological issue, because there's a lot that we don't understand there. Yeah, I mean, there are people reaching that we're finding are coming from quite a extreme and disturbing perspective of bitterness and division and apathy. We can't just look at it and say, "Oh, this is crazy. What are you doing? Like, this isn't right." We need to actually understand like how they got to that point so that we can fix it. Because unfortunately, the good news is that the window of people alive and in power is always moving, and that's how the mindset will really change. But unfortunately, the time scale is a little too short now, and we actually can't wait for the youth to be in power. I have various theories about how people can get to that point, but they're not very well developed yet.
I really appreciate those comments. I mean, in my experience, real authority is received, not taken. So, how is it that a 16-year-old like Greta Thunberg can be addressing the UN summit?
Yeah.
I mean, it's because she was given that role, not because she stormed the gates. And that's because of who she is.
She just speaks clearly. It's so crucial that we choose our words, choose just the right words for this time.
I agree 100%.
When she opened up her speech with, "We've been watching you," that hit me between the eyes.
Yeah. I really appreciate Derek's comments. I think that was in part why I wanted to put the radical cards on the table, to be upfront, because I know that a lot of people that I know who are against action with respect to climate change, they have become convinced, I don't know what the process was, but they have become convinced that this is a play for global government. And I want to put on the table the fact that these are actually global issues, and we're going to have to address our coordination from that perspective. We hopefully we can do this in a way that the way nature works, which is scaling from the ground up. Nature, there's no king tree that governs all of the forests. There's no king bear that governs all the bears. Nature does things from the ground up, and that's the most scalable form of coordination. And yet we find that there are networks within networks within networks of coordination, even amongst the trees. And we're just now beginning to appreciate that. And that's the kind of thing that I think we have to bring to bear when we're talking about practical action. We are going to have to coordinate in a way we never have before, and it's going to require this balance between the collective and the individual that we've never seen before. Unless we are open and transparent about that, I think people will view these kinds of discussions with a great deal of suspicion. But I think if we say, hey, this is just a fact, we can't avoid this anymore. That moreover, this is the step that humanity is being called to take. We might be able to bridge the gap. But I know a lot of people do have these concerns that climate change is a play for a global government.
Of course, there's so much to say here, and this is a really good conversation, and I hope that this could somehow be a series, possibly.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's clear that RChain is coming from a really important perspective that most of the blockchains aren't. And I think that RChain could make more explicit this fact in order to attract the kind of people that you were talking about. I think it could afford to make this kind of stuff a lot more explicit, because its success in some kind of hypothetical world where everything is fine and it just becomes a normal, good internet, that's never going to happen. I mean, it sounds like we all agree that like the real purpose of the whole system is just going to be helping the world manage with all this. And so it sounds like the topic of this kind of conversation should become a lot more explicit in RChain itself and how it brings in people.
I agree, and I think that's why we had this conversation today, was to begin to make that clear.